My talk has basically got three parts. One is the overview of the history of the All Hallows Convent building. The second part is an outline of the planning processes in the development of, or the redevelopment of the museum. So things like the plan and the brief, the themes that we developed, and also practical things like the label hierarchy. And then lots of pretty pictures and examples. So, okay, so this is Adderton, built in 1858. You might recognise it's older than Old Government House by a couple of years. This one was built by John Petrie for Dr. George Fullerton and his family, and the Fullertons lived there for 2 years. So it's quite significant because John Petrie became Brisbane's first mayor in 1859, and George Fullerton was a member of the first Legislative Council of Queensland. Plus it's a pre-Queensland building, with 1859 being separation. Can't turn the page. Okay, so we also had quite a lot of documentary evidence in the Sisters of Mercy collection. That image there is a sketch by one of the art teachers from the 1930s, and it's a sketch of a photograph of the early house. There's also things like the newspaper account of the construction of the building and naming the people involved. The reporter didn't like the architecture, calling it an exceedingly plain but strong building in the London street style. External appearance has been sacrificed for convenience and comfort within. This one is a sketch of Ann Street in 1858. It's from the valley looking towards the city, and the building on the top of the hill on the left is Adderton. And also this was another of the All Hallows art teachers. So with separation of Queensland from New South Wales, that created a new Roman Catholic diocese. The Bishop Quinn was appointed as the first bishop, and he sought out the Sisters of Mercy to come and start Catholic education in Queensland. So this is a mural that was painted on the wall of St Stephen's Cathedral, depicting the arrival of the bishop, the priests, and the 6 Sisters of Mercy there on the side. The St Stephen's Church or Cathedral building is in the background there as well. So that was a life-size mural, life-size figures, and it was sandblasted off the wall during the restoration of St Stephen's in 1988. This is Brisbane in 1862. So the sisters and the priests arrived in Queensland in 1861. They took over an existing school at St Stephen's. So that's St Stephen's there. And this is the house that the sisters lived in. This is Queen Street. That's where Hungry Jack's is on the mall, if you want to know. And that block of land there, the swamp, that was where they built City Hall. That's why it's sunk. And then this one is the next part across of that panorama. And that is Adderton. Oh, I forgot to point out Government House. Anyway. And this is Ann Street. There. So, as I said, the Fullertons spent 3 years trying to sell the house, and in November 1863, the bishop bought the house for the sisters as their first permanent home and gave them the bill. So they established their network of schools, and health, education and welfare were their main ministry areas. So over the years that has meant a number of different things, but basically it was the head office and the mother house for the congregation. So the school operated in this building as well. So the 2 front rooms on the ground floor there were the classrooms, and the 2 equivalent rooms upstairs were the boarders' dormitories, and the sisters fit in the attic. And a number of other buildings on the grounds that they rented. So the building was extended in 1892, and the original building was left intact Basically, they took the roof off the old house, added another level, and then extended it out in both directions. So as you look at the picture, the two chimneys towards the left-hand end, that's the border of the 1858 house. And this is just a slightly later picture. The bishop also bought a house across the road from the sisters to keep an eye on them, and that's his house in the background on the right. So as I said, it was the congregation head office from 1863 right up until 1975. It was a residence from 1858 with the Fullerton family up until 2007 when the 12 sisters living there moved out, and we were given a large piece of the building to turn into the museum. So we were in one part already, but basically we were given a third of the building. So we were given the 1858 ground floor and the whole first floor to turn into the museum. This is developing the interpretation plan. So we had to consider things like the use and other users of the building and the grounds. It's in a school of 1,600 students. So it's a publicly accessible museum within that space. So that presents a lot of problems for the school and for us to get people in there. The other sort of consequence of the decision to give us part of the building is that the school was in the other parts of the building, and sensitive areas like school counsellors were sort of right next to where the Heritage Centre ended up being in the building. So we couldn't let people wander through the building. Every visitor had to be guided. In terms of audiences, we knew the groups that were already coming to the Heritage Centre, so that was predominantly aged groups and school groups. But the sisters wanted particularly for the place to be a place where people working in the ministries or the businesses of the sisters could learn about that history. So that was a primary audience, not so much the public. They weren't so interested in big visitor numbers as long as we had the right sort of visitor. The types of visitors, I don't know if you've heard this term before, but there's the streaker, the student and the scholar. So the streaker museum visitor is the person who walks into the room, looks around and walks back out again. The student's the one who reads every fifth label, and the scholar is the one who reads every single word. Yeah. So obviously when you have to guide every visitor, and every single visitor has to be guided. The guides need to have something to do. So we had a number of different scripts where the guides could add extra things, and the labels and the text was written in a certain way so that we had extra stories to tell. I would also say there's a fourth type of visitor, and that's the stunned mullet. And they're the ones who go into the room, and because there's a guide there, they just stand there with their arms folded and wait for you to tell them what to look at. So that was something we had to consider as well. We obviously wanted people to come back. We didn't want them to come once and then never come back. So there was also a structure for different itineraries through the building, so they didn't have to do a full hour and a half, 2 hour tour in one go. They could come and see a bit and then go away and then come back another time. What else did I miss? Educational opportunities is about the connections to the national curriculum, and also our museum was obviously one that uniquely connected to the religious curriculum, and also with the history curriculum being developed at the time that we did this. That was something that we kept in mind as well. And also the focus on primary and secondary sources that is in the curriculum now. Planning documents, there was sisters' sort of dreams from 20, 30 years ago. There is very useful when you're trying to articulate to justify to the people paying the bills and there were documents from the Vatican. So there was a Pontifical Commission for the Cultural Heritage of the Church, and a few other ones like that that added a bit of weight to me saying that things need to be done properly. So there was also a fairly extensive conservation management plan that was commissioned for the building. Mainly the sisters wanting to stop other things happening in the building. So there was a concern that if it went to the school, that they'd knock out walls, they'd introduce walls, and some of that history of the building would be lost. So there's some quite specific guidelines and policies in the conservation management plan. Okay, so the exhibition themes that we came up with, there was 6. Each space could have, well, should have at least one, but it could have up to all 6. So beginnings with the foundation stories. Health is the sisters work with visiting the sick, nursing, healthcare and hospitals. Education was the 52 Sisters of Mercy schools throughout Queensland set up by the Brisbane congregation, but also things like catechism and music and the arts, which the sisters were quite prominent in, tertiary education and industrial schools. So they were where they taught needlework and sewing, and later on shorthand and typing and that sort of thing. Welfare, the sisters had a number of initiatives over the years, including care of children, and the first orphanage in Queensland was set up by the sisters. They had a home for unmarried mothers at a time where that was socially unacceptable. Care for intellectually disabled and aged care and refugees are much more modern initiatives. Religious life is about prayer, spirituality, the training and the internal evidence of that in the building. And then building history is obviously changes within the building and its use. Living stakeholders was a big one because you would get a story from someone and then you would have 5 other people contradict that story. So, and delivery. So delivery, it was delivered in 3 stages. 2010 was the ground floor, 2011 was most of the first floor, and 2012 was the main exhibition. So we needed to make sure that that framework and those consistency of messages stayed throughout the whole museum, and it didn't look like things were done 3 years apart. So one of the key things in that was the label hierarchy. So there was a room history panel in most rooms, which was the specific history of that building, a story panel, which is about the exhibition in that space, a sub-story panel, which were smaller ones just to tell little anecdotes, and then the labels. So these are room history panel examples, and basically the image at the bottom is the part of the building that it's in. So you can see the first one's an 1858 image, the next one's the 1892 extension, the third one's the chapel as it looked in 1961, and then the sacristy is where the priests dressed, so this is them queuing up. The big red sections, is that clear on the screen? Those are quotes, so some of those are newspaper clippings, some of them are anecdotes from the governors of the time, some of them are the transcription of the foundation stone that's outside the building and hidden behind a hedge. So we put that on the panel inside the chapel. So it's all just part of that story. The major story panels, these are just examples again. And the backgrounds on these, the graphic design, we had it tied to the building. So if you can see some of the details in the background of those panels, one is taken from a bedspread, as a pattern from a bedspread that was used in all the Sisters of Mercy boarding schools. Another one is a detail from a fan light, the glass panel above the door. And another one is stencil that was painted in the chapel. And those other ones as well. All right, so sub-story panels, these are the little ones. So there's 4 different ones here. One is a paraphrased anecdote. Another one is a sort of a job description of a particular role of one of the sisters. And we had a really nice photo of that sister. So that's a photo from about 1950, and we had a photo of her mid-80s standing next to that panel, being very proud that she was featured. The next one is a newspaper extract, and the last one is a story that one of the sisters told us. These are just labels just to show there's different. So you can see there's different word counts and there's different ways that those have been done. Some of them talk about objects in different ways, but so these ones I just called them specialty panels. So these were in different areas, generally as a barrier or on a sort of a handrail, for want of a better word. One of the things with the orphanage, the green one's the orphanage one, is there were obviously positive and negative histories, and I was quite clear that I didn't really want to hide the bad stuff, and the sisters were quite happy with that. So the little newspaper articles you can see there, one is an inspection by the minister saying how wonderful it all was. Another one is a story of a woman who went to the orphanage and took her son, went to the train station, took him for an outing for the day, and she ended up spending 2 weeks in jail because she didn't have the authority of the minister to take her son out. Yeah, there are those positive and negative parts of the history that, we really shouldn't hide. So this is the visitor map of all the exhibitions. So this is the ground floor, and that's the 1858 house there. And then up on the first floor, that's the 1858 house there. So it's about, there was about 26 exhibition elements, permanent exhibitions in the redevelopment of the centre. This is an early version of a sketch from the exhibition designers, and basically because of the, if you look at the conservation management, that's what CMP, Conservation Management Plan Policy 13, it talks about an interpretation plan. So the designers came up with the idea of offsetting all the introduced elements at 30 degrees. So all those blue, or is it purple, elements you can see, those are the new parts. So the exhibition furniture, the cabinets, the glass barriers that we put through and things like that. So we've set them on an angle to make it clear that it's separate to the original building. It did change a bit from that early sketch, but again, this one's about layering the layers of the history. Again, there's another conservation management policy there, but basically we had someone scalpel off the layers of paint, and they're dated there. So that's the 1863, 1892, 1930s and 1950s colour schemes of the convent. So we also removed a couple of walls, non-original walls, which meant that we had bigger exhibition spaces as well. So this area became an open collection store. So some of the artwork within the collection was on display, but also within storage, and it had a motion sensor that put the lights on for a couple of minutes so that people could see what was in there, get a sense of the space, and then we could keep going. Some of these are about linking stories with spaces. I won't go into what the first one is because it's a pretty tricky topic to explain, but that's about religious relics. The next one is sacred vessels, so the church chalices and ciboriums and various other things, but that was in a room at the back of the chapel, the priest's dressing area, the sacristy. All right, so these ones now are a bit more detailed examples. So this was the ground floor front room, one of the very first ones that you walk into. And originally it was one of the classrooms for All Hallows School. The little inset picture at the bottom is what it looked like before we did the exhibition work, and then the big one's obviously what it looks like now. So the conservation policy said that we had to retain these rooms on the ground floor as large meeting spaces. So we kept the furniture from the probably about the 1880s. This table seems to have come in when the school had its own separate building built and the kids moved out of the building. So this was a meeting space. On the other side of one wall is we had a couple of desks, student desks from the 1900s lined up. There were things inside the desk because we found that when the sisters moved out, we did big tours of the convent when it was empty and there was lots of people coming in looking at things, and we set up some dummy displays in some of the rooms, and people kept opening up the desks to see nothing inside. So we put things inside these ones so that they could open them up and see photos of the school over time. The big graphic on the wall there we had made to look like a blackboard, so that brings in part of that school history as well. And that's the room history panel, sort of just sticking at the side there. This was the story of the founder of the Sisters of Mercy, Catherine Macaulay, and it was in the other ground floor entry space. The room was called the Green Parlor because it had a green hearth, and the sisters had a small little display case of, you probably see the Barbie dolls of the sisters dressed up in the case there. And I didn't want to use the Barbie dolls, but we did use quite a lot of the things that are in that original case that the sisters had set up. We used in the big case that we introduced into the space there. Okay. Can anyone see any writing on that slide? No. All right. So that's the external wall of the 1858 building. You can see the archway in the doorway there. So that's the external wall of the 1858 building, and that's the 1892 stairwell there. So what we have done there is a modern version of what was called the chapel list. So it was a list in order of death of the Sisters of Mercy, and we had them stenciled on the wall in a font based on the handwriting of one of the early sisters, using a laser cut stencil. So they were sponged on the wall to look aged, and they wrapped right around the stairwell there, and there's room for the ones that are still alive to fit on the wall as well. I don't know if you can see that one any better. It's very difficult to photograph. But there was, if you look at that little token box there, as the sisters came down the stairs and into the chapel for prayers, they'd take a numbered token, look up the number on the list and pray for that sister for the day. And then the tokens get put back in the other side, and then everyone gets prayed for. So the little inset is the before. To the right of that image is the altar frontal, the carved front part of the altar that was in the chapel from 1905 to 1968. And when they changed the chapel with Vatican II, the altar was cut apart, but they did keep the carved front section of the altar, and for some reason they took it upstairs. So we decided to put it back into the chapel. Also, when we pull up the carpet, you can see in the big image the different floorboards. So that was because there were two stairwells originally in that area from 1890s to the 1950s, and one was for the junior, one was for the novices, and one was for the fully professed sisters. So they weren't allowed to talk to each other, and they weren't allowed to use the same set of stairs, and they had two separate entrances into the chapel. So by exposing that, you can see from the floorboards where the old staircase was. And there's if you can see it probably just looks like a big flash on the wall on the right. So that's a wall quote. So a wall quote is basically a story from a person. So this is one of the sisters trying to explain to other people what religious life is about. So we use those practically in every exhibition, in every space. So this is definitely one of the visitor favourite exhibitions, and this was the Novice Ship. If you look at the top image, in the 1970s, one of the sisters set up a little art gallery up there with a fluorescent light header around the room and a picture rail and some beautiful 1990s green curtains. So we pulled all that out, but you can see the statue stand in the corner still, and the cross and the statue of Mary is still in the same room, and also the desks. So these desks were 1892 for this building. This room was built as the Novice Ship or the novitiate, where the sisters did their religious training. So we used those desks, and there's a big bus reproduction down one side of the room there as well. So this is just one of the desks open, and you can see all the things that are inside. So these are, this one is a story about why a sister entered the order, why she became a sister, and there's a whole series of little photos in there as well. And this one is just to show the different ways that people were using the space. Two big 8-seater desks, so there was 16 seats in the room, so it's quite good for school groups. And there's a big group of people looking at all the desks there. There's a sister standing in front of a mannequin which is of herself. None of the wedding dresses that they wore during their reception ceremonies were still existed. So we had to recreate this one from a photograph. So that's her standing next to a mannequin of herself. And then the kids doing the dress-up activities. So we had a costume maker make some novices, postulants and junior professed sisters' habits, because they were always used for prayer services, centenary celebrations, that sort of thing. That includes some reenactment as part of that. And they would often wear the wrong habits. So we had some proper ones made so that they were historically accurate and they fit kids. This is just a music room set up like a music room would have been set up. And you can probably see we didn't put cabinets in there, it's just a glass barrier across the room. And this is a close-up just to show you one of those barrier panels. So that's talking about some of the objects that are on display in there. This is a bedroom or a cell. And again, the conservation plan saying that we had to keep a representative sample of the cells and they should be interpreted. And also that's one of the sub-story panels there. So the chapel was a bit of a challenge because it was a functioning sacred space that needed to be interpreted discreetly. So up in the choir gallery upstairs, there were two sections of wall, and that's where we put the room history panels. So one has the chapel as it was in 1892, and the chapel extension shows a photo of the chapel in 1961. And obviously you can see what the chapel looks like because you're standing in it. And then the guides there also do additional interpretation. Up in the choir gallery there was a little handrail as well, so there was some additional interpretation down there, so that it wasn't visible from people using the chapel or kids who were supposed to be paying attention to Mass. So these things were upstairs on the barrier. You can see the photo of the guide with the two students, and that's that 1905 to 1968 altar frontal that we've brought back down into the chapel. And then there's a photographic panel on the top to show the different changes to the inside of the chapel. So things like the way the seating was laid out, the different floors that it's had at different times. That's all in those little photos. Now I've got a wall quote now. It's my favourite one from the whole centre. Is anyone here from Melbourne or Geelong? Oh, good. This was from one of the sisters writing in 1860 to get permission to go to Brisbane. So her argument was that much sin might be prevented by instructing the females of this first small population, and the irreligion and immorality would not grow as they have in Melbourne and Geelong. It's a good one. And then this is the main exhibition space. So it was the convent community room. This is a photo of it from about 1909. This is where the sisters had a fairly structured day, but they had an hour and 15 minutes of free time, and it was usually together in the community room. So that's the community room there. That's what it will look like in 2007. When the sisters moved out, we had tours inside the convent of all 4 levels, just to show people what it looked like before we got hold of it and the school got hold of it. So we had part of those tours were morning tea in the community room. You might notice that the statue and the cross are pretty well there most of the time in these images. This is 2008 when we had the floor done and the big glass wall got pulled down. This is 2009 when our museum blinds went in and our lighting went in, and the buggy got craned up onto the second floor of the building through the window and built inside the space. And that's the completed exhibition. So you can see again those big flashes up on the wall. Those are the wall quotes around the room. And I'll just put another one up there. So this was not a chronological exhibition, it was a thematic one. So there were the areas that the sisters had worked in, health, education and welfare. Education, we had the story of the 52 Sisters of Mercy schools. Because it was based at All Hallows, there was a feeling that it would focus on All Hallows. So we had to make sure that they were all got equal representation. So there was, I don't think I'll put a slide in of that, but there was a way that we dealt with that. And this one is just to show you some of those barrier panels again. And this one is, the one at the front there is that orphanage one that I mentioned. So it's right at the front of the carriage. The carriage was associated with the orphanage. And we also did quite deliberate things in the case. So there was the 1894 orphanage licence from the governor, and right next to it was Kevin Rudd's apology. So we did quite deliberately do some of those things just to show the positive and the negative stories. My last slide is a 2011 we did the National Standards program, and this is a comment from our reviewers. The layering of building interpretation, personal accounts and interpretation of objects, artefacts and personalities is interwoven throughout each of the spaces, and this assists the visitor to build up a comprehensive understanding of the life and the work of the sisters. All right.